No, we played 2 rounds.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, we won all. Yeah.
No, we literally just got the score.
Are you sure? I thought you guys won a round.
No.
Oh. I think I just had a Berenstain Bears moment.
A Berenstain Bears moment?
You know how like the what's it called? The Mandela effect? Where you remember whatever.
I love the Berenstain Bears.
You know, the Berenstain Bear rider is Christian.
That makes sense.
They have like, yes. Oh, that would be perfect, probably.
Don't worry, guys. It's not Yours is very
Perfect.
Luke 12, don't worry.
Don't worry.
Why are you talking about yourself? Oh, wait, never mind.
Yeah, my name is not Luke, Riley. My name is not Luke.
Man, Ryan, that was gonna be such a good joke. If only you knew his name.
Okay, guys. So, today we are going to be in Luke 12. What we're going to be talking about in Luke 12 is don't worry and not worrying. And it is maybe one of the weirdest, at least to me, commands that Jesus says. At least when I just read it off the top of my, like when I just read it, I was like, I don't know how you're supposed to do this. Okay? So, bow your heads with me. We're going to pray really quick. Lord, help us to understand what worry is. Lord, help us to see it in ourselves when we are worrying, and help us to fight against that impulse. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, guys, so
You said heads instead of eyes.
I always do so.
No, you said bow your head.
Oh, did I?
Bow your eyes.
Oh my gosh, I'm the worst. I cannot keep it straight now. Do you know I once said that in a college class? I was in a college preaching class, and I said, bow your eyes and close your heads. And then at the end of the thing, I got my grade, and I got minus points for it. And the next time I gave it again, I did the exact same thing again. I did it on purpose. And my teacher was like, you did it again. I was like, yeah, no, I'm just ornery. We're going to be in Luke 12. If you want to be there, we'll get there in a second. We're going to be in Luke 12:22. And the first thing I want to talk about, guys, is the difference between anxiety and worry. Because I think often when I think about anxiety and worry, I think that they are synonymous. I think often when we use them, they are, but I don't think that that is how Jesus is using them, okay? So, I think anxiety, and this is if you look up the official, medical definition, anxiety is when you feel unease or fear, okay? You feel unease or fear about something, okay? Usually something either in the future or something that you don't know what has happened, okay? It could have been in the past, but you're like, who knows? So I could feel anxiety if I knew that Connor got in a car crash, but I didn't know if he was okay or not, but I know what happened in the past. I'd be like, I have anxiety about that. Or I could have anxiety and be like, I turned in a college application and I don't know if I'm going to get accepted. I could have anxiety about that. Does that make sense? Sense of unease or fear. Worry is when you dwell on your anxiety. Who knows what the word dwell is? The word dwell is one of my favorite words. So, dwell is when you start thinking about it a lot. When you take that thought,
Living within.
that's a dwelling, but close. Okay. So, dwell is when you start thinking about something. You have maybe an anxious thought, and you just sit there and you just kind of sit in it for a long period of time. You go, oh my gosh, well, if I don't get accepted, to college, then I'm going to be homeless. And then if I'm homeless, then I won't have any food. And then my family will hate me and I'll die in a ditch. Okay, that would be the idea of dwelling instead of just feeling anxious. Elijah, what do you got? Thank you. Okay. Anxiety can also be when you start taking actions because of your anxiety. That's when I start feeling fear or unease. And I don't take actions that make sense necessarily, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I should just start taking actions because that'll make me feel better. Okay? That would also be one of the things that happens in worry. We'll talk about both of those as we go forward. I just want you guys to know those definitions. That is what we're working with. And when I say anxiety, what I mean is a sense of unease and fear. And when I say worry, I mean when you either dwell on it or when you start taking actions towards it. Okay? So, the last time I can remember having a ridiculous kind of anxiety was actually in this first sense. So there's two kind of ways that I think that we often get anxiety. There's a few others, but these are the ones that I think make a lot of sense to me. Is things we had control and then gave away, and things we can't control at all. At least not very much. Okay. Things we had control and then gave away. The perfect example is homework. You have 100% control over the homework that you do, right? You have all the control in the world. As soon as you turn that homework in, you no longer have control over that homework, right?
Somebody's homework.
Okay, and the other thing is things you can't control at all, or at least very much. If I vote, still don't control politics very much. There are over 760 million cars in the world, and that's not including planes or boats. If I try to drive a little bit better gas mileage, I should try to do that, but that's not going to put a drop in the bucket, right? I don't have that much control over that. Or injustice in other countries. You know what? I hear about Ukraine or the Democratic Republic of Congo, how they mine cobalt with their hands, and you know what? I have zero control over that. Okay? So two kinds of things that bring us anxiety often. Things we had control and we gave away, and things we can't control at all. And I told Aurelia that her name was in the presentation today. And this goes back to, I once was doing a paper for a class called Christianity and Stoic Philosophy, which was a class that at the end of it I had to write an 18-page paper. And if you know me at all and how I relate to school, that means that I waited until the last day to write this 18-page paper and do any of the research for it. Okay? So I sit down and in 10 hours, I do all of the research and write an 18-page paper on Marcus Aurelius. That's how you spell Marcus Aurelius, okay? Just for importance. And then at the end of this, I literally finished this paper. I sent it in, and it was like I was a Zoom class. So I sent it in, and literally less than a minute later, I was giving a 20-minute presentation on this paper that I had written throughout the semester, of course. And at the end of that, my teacher informed me, he said, Jake, it felt like you had so much of it so fresh in your brain. And I was like, yes, I did. I practiced a lot. I had it right there. I was practicing right before class. But right after I finished my presentation, I looked at the paper and I had noticed that I had only misspelled Marcus Aurelius' name one time. And it was in the title of my paper that I turned in which I had spelled it Marcus Aurelius.
Oh.
And now, this is the last week of school. And I was like, oh my crap. I'm so worried. He's probably going to get really he's going to get annoyed or by that he's going to notice it. Obviously, I'm going to lose a bunch of points. I don't know why I would lose a ton of points from this, but I had this anxiety, this sense of unease and fear about it. So what did I do? I did maybe the dumbest thing you can possibly do. I sent an email apologizing that I had misspelled the name in the title of my paper. Now, this teacher, his name's Joey Dodson, and he is really, really bad at grading on time. And he doesn't read his emails when he's grading because he's usually so behind at the end of the semester. So I got an email 3 weeks later. It's almost at Christmas or after Christmas when the semester was over. And I got an email. And I'd been freaking out for weeks because he had not put the grade in. And he put in the grade, and then apparently he had looked in at the email after he put all the grades in, and he said, oh, I didn't even notice. Because he had been so frantically grading, but he had just skipped over that idea entirely, the title entirely, and had not missed it. But actually, my action when I was afraid, when I had unease, my worried action actually put me in more danger of getting it noticed, not less. Right? You see how my anxiety led to a worried action that actually made things worse, potentially. Make sense? Okay, so, and then again, there are things we can't control or have very little control over, right? So, I want you guys to say this with me. I made it really big so everyone can read it. So, we're going to say it out loud. Worry, give into anxiety. When we dwell on anxiety and we start taking actions out of our anxiety. Okay, good job everyone. We're so good at that. I messed up. So worry is when we give into our anxiety, when we dwell on our anxiety, and when we start taking actions out of our anxiety. Okay? I just want you guys to remember that as we go into Luke 12, 22 through 26. Okay? So Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, do what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens, they do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them, and how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Okay? Now, if you read this word here as anxiety, you'll be like, Jesus, I can't help it. Right? You can't help having fear or unease. But if you read it as something that is an action that you take, or dwelling on your anxiety, if you have anxiety about what you will eat or what you will wear, don't act in a worried way, and don't dwell on that in a worried way. Right? We can trust God, and it doesn't actually do anything. So those are Jesus' 3 points. When we worry, often, not always, but often we worry about secondary things. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, when you worry, you're worrying about food and clothing, and probably a bunch of other things like grades on homework. But those are secondary things. And you might say to me, Jake, how is food and clothing a secondary thing? That sounds ridiculous, right? But if we go back to what Jesus said, he said, because life is about more than what you will eat. And your body is about more than about what you will wear. And if we think about our life is more than about what we eat in our own existence, that will change our perception a little bit of what we worry about. Okay? We'll talk about that more in a second. The second one, right, he talks about the birds. He says that Jesus pointed out that is, we can trust God. The birds eat. They don't worry about it. They don't grow food, and they still eat. We can trust God with our worries. And third, even if you do worry, has worrying ever been effective in actually helping you solve your problems? Twice. We'll talk about that in this moment. Okay. So, is worry, we can worry, but it is ineffective. Okay? So, consider how the wildflowers grow. I don't know why I'm reading out of this. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today, and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Feels like Jesus is repeating himself. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Okay? So, again, we go to this objection. God doesn't always come through. And this is an objection that I hear and I've heard a lot, and actually an objection that I have myself, usually whenever I read this part, this talking about Jesus, is, you know what? But there are Christians who starve to death. Right? There are Christians who pray about it and still get killed. So how are we not supposed to worry? And I think this goes to what Paul said when I think Paul's referencing when Jesus says, you know, hey, life is about more than the body. Paul said at one point, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And as Christians, we can think about our life primarily should be about spreading the kingdom of God, growing in relationship with God, and becoming more like Christ. And everything else is secondary to that. And those things are not things that worrying ever helps make better. Okay? Now, will God provide food? Often he will, right? Will God provide safety and protection? I think more often than we even think he does. But this is the idea that if you're worrying about food, you know what? If you're in the apocalypse and you're like worried about running out of food, if God wants to make sure you're going to live, he's going to make sure you have food. And if you don't have food, well, you know what? Maybe God is saying it's okay for you to come to heaven, right? And in that, what it makes me, reminds me a lot of is when people start fretting about whether it be like COVID and being like, oh my gosh, what if we all die? We should never be around anybody. Or when people start worrying about any of these other things, when they start getting hyper worried. Have you guys ever met someone who's hyper worried about things and like changing their life and making different decisions? Like my grandmother, lovely lady, during COVID would wear a mask and an N95 mask, which is like a special mask, on top of each other while riding her bike. She almost passed out on the side of the road one time because she was so worried that while she was riding her bike, she would get sick. And that is letting worry actually hurt her life, okay? So we don't need to run around and be worried because, number one, we know where we're going, right? But also, we know that God will provide for us as he wants to. And as he desires to save us, he will. And that doesn't mean do stupid things, right? It doesn't mean jump off a cliff, obviously. But what it does mean is you don't have to worry about smaller things. You can do what you think you're supposed to do, okay? So, here are the two main ways, I actually have them on two different sides, the two main ways that worry shows up. So analysis paralysis. I always make fun of my friend Joe for having analysis paralysis, and he has that during board games.
Mm-hmm.
We actually, to the point where at one point we called them Joe turns, because what would happen is, like, if we were playing games, Connor would take a turn and take like 30 seconds, Janelle would take a turn and it would take like 30 seconds, then I would take a turn and it would take 30 seconds, and then 10 minutes for Joe to think, and then he would take his turn, and then 30 seconds, 30 seconds, 15 minutes, it's getting more serious. And you're like, Joe, oh my gosh, make a decision, it's not that hard. And he's like, no, I gotta think. And what would happen to him is he'd be so worried that he wasn't seeing something that he thought he should see, that he would just sit there. It's not like he was calculating. He was sitting there worrying that he was missing something, okay? And this is a really good example. Is I actually knew a kid who would do his math homework. And every night his parents would sit down with him and do his math homework. He wasn't very good at math. And they would help him do his math homework. He was like 3rd, 4th grade. And he would get to school, and then he would never get turned in. And his teacher would go to his parents and be like, why is he, like, his parents would go, why do you have a 0 in math? And his teacher would go, why is your kid not doing any of his homework? Until they finally sat down for a parent-teacher conference, and they were like both like asking these questions, and the others were like, I'm doing all I can. And they found out, they went over to his desk, you know those like desks that open up? They opened up his desk and they found all of his math homework from the entire year. And he was so afraid of getting a bad grade on his math homework that he would do it and stick it in his desk so that no one could tell him that it was wrong, like that he got any problems wrong. Okay? Do you see the problem with this? Is that by worrying, he's paralyzing himself, and he's going to say, nope, I'm not going to let myself fail. No one can fail me. No one can tell me my math homework is wrong because they're never going to see it. But actually, by doing that, he's getting a worse grade than otherwise. So sometimes what worry does is it makes us freeze, and it makes us do exactly 0 things, okay? And when worry freezes you, it's actually, I would say, a way of taking control. It's saying, I'm worried about this thing, I'm not going to give someone the opportunity to fail me. Or I'm not going to give myself the opportunity to be judged as a failure, okay? Does that make sense how that's about control, or can be about control? When you freeze, it's like, I control this hard enough, then no one will be able to tell me that I'm stupid because they didn't grade my math homework. But actually just makes it happen worse. Okay? In the same way, if you were really afraid about getting turned down for a job, filled out your resume, and then just never turned it in, do you think you're going to get the job?
No.
No, but you have decided that you're not going to get it because you didn't turn it in, not because they said no. Right? Okay. The other kind of worry, if you guys, does anybody know Pokemon? Okay, this is Magikarp. He's one of the greatest Pokemon ever.
Bro, I still have the original.
If you don't know Magikarp, this is the description from the original game he's in. When you catch him, this is what it tells you. Magikarp uses Slash, but it does nothing. Okay? Now, this is what happens. I'm going to say this is called flailing around. This is the other response to worry. It's when I just start doing things. Okay? And the problem with it is that often the reason we're worried, right, is about things that we don't have control over. And so when I'm worried about, let's say a relationship that I want to have, or about a job I want to get, or a college I want to get into, is when I ask or when I send in my resume or send in my application, I cannot control what the person on the other side of that is going to do, right? You just can't. You could send in a resume and it could be the most beautiful resume ever done, and you did all your work, and they look at it and they're like, I don't like the name Deanna, so that resume is gone, right? Or you send in your college application, they're like, we have too many Bens this year. Get rid of that one. They don't even look at the resume or the application, right? So you just don't have the ability to control people's reactions. And in response, you can do lots of things to try to control people's reactions. And I really think that this is a lot like Magikarp. If you know Magikarp, until he evolves in the original game, until he evolves at level 20, you usually catch him at like level 5, level 7 in the original game, he evolves at level 20, he knows one move and it is Splash. You can use it 20 times, and every time it splashes, it does exactly 0 things. And the other guy gets to move, and then you get to do Splash, and it does 0 things. Now, if you get to the place where you've used all 20 uses of Splash and it just does nothing, you start using a secret move called Struggle. Okay, and Struggle hits the other Pokemon and himself. And it's a really bad move because it actually does more damage to you than to them. Okay? Okay, now think about this. The original Magikarp, when it would splash around and nothing would happen, and then it would start struggling and hurting others, but also itself. Okay? Now, you're thinking, why in the world would you ever catch this Pokemon? Right? Why would you ever catch this Pokemon? It sounds like the most worthless piece of garbage ever. Okay? And if you know Pokemon, what you know is that it evolves into one of the best water type Pokemon in the game, which is Gyarados or Gyarados or however you say it. I don't know. And when you get that, it is way better than any other Pokemon that you can get at that point in the game. But it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of patience. And the best way to get it is actually, hey, Elijah and Sam, thank you. Okay. The best way to get it is actually to put Magikarp out there, and then as soon as the battle starts, to take him out and put a different Pokemon in there, and then he gets some of the XP to advance. And so actually the best way to get Magikarp to evolve in the original game is to do nothing with him. How many of you guys have ever been in a position where you felt like the best option was to do nothing? You know? How many of you guys ever felt like the best option was to do nothing? And this isn't nothing like I'm going to not let anything happen. It's not nothing like I'm going to analysis paralysis freeze. But sometimes when things are out of your control, you're supposed to do nothing. And if you think about it, you would know lots of those times. Right? Because there's times when we don't have control. That we try one of these 3 strategies. We try to manipulate to control other people's actions. We try to control what we can't. And we try to control other things that aren't what is making us anxious. Okay? So, if you manipulate to control another's actions, you're like, oh my gosh, I want my brother to do these chores for me. How can I manipulate them until they are willing to do it? You know what? Sometimes your brother is younger than you and not very smart and will do it. But honestly, what happens when you try to manipulate people is they get annoyed with you, they get frustrated because they can tell, especially as you get older, people can tell when you're trying to manipulate them, right? No one enjoys it, and it actually is more often gets you the thing you don't want, right? If you try to manipulate someone, you're trying to manipulate your parents and like giving you ice cream or something. The more you try to be underhanded about it, the less likely they are to give it to you, right? Have you ever seen a time when like you were like blatantly trying to manipulate your parents and they noticed and they were like, oh, that's fine? No, they hate it. You hate it. Everyone hates it, right? Okay, now trying to control what we can't. Could you imagine how weird it would be if you sent in your college application and then you started like calling the college. It was like, so I got accepted. And they're like, we haven't even gotten your application yet. What are you talking about? Right? When you give something to someone and when someone else is in control, if you try to exert control over that, they're just going to tell you to stop and they're going to get frustrated with you. Right? And then my absolute favorite, try to control other things that aren't what is making us anxious. I don't know why anyone, including myself, thinks this is going to work. We're like, I am so anxious, let's say, about my mother's health. I am going to religiously clean my house and make sure that everything is spotless. And I'm going to go on a crazy cleaning tirade. Does anybody have a parent who goes on crazy cleaning tirades? Yep. Okay.
Mother.
Yep. So if you've ever seen that, do crazy cleaning tirades ever make anyone feel less anxious? No. They clean and they clean and they clean, and then they think, I'm still anxious. Why has this last 8 hours of work not helped anything? And it's like, because you're trying to control things that aren't what making you anxious. It's like, if you're... And then you realize that in the end, someone makes a mess of it anyways, right? So, all three of these things are what I think is like flailing around and struggling. It's going to hurt you just as much as it hurts actually the chances of what you want to happen. Okay? So, when we are worried, when we act in a worried way, it's when we're anxious, and then we start flailing around and trying to fix problems that we don't have control over. And if you've noticed, all of those things are about control, right? They're all about me trying to control things that I can't control, whether that be I'm a kid and I have analysis paralysis and I'm trying to hide my homework so that no one sees it, right? So that no one sees it so they can't tell me that I'm failing. That's me trying to control and actually making things worse, versus like sending a college application in and then like calling and calling and calling, or sending a job application in and calling and calling and calling, or trying to have people put in good words for you while you have your college, like your application in. And it's like, people are like, hey, bro, it's just a pizza place, please stop. Okay? So, there are lots of different ways we try to exert control, but I think a lot of times what we need to do is gotta think, when things are out of our control, we can take that sense of unease, give it to God, and say, you know what, God, I have fear or unease or anxiety about this thing. Help me to process that and to deal with it. And help me to be able to deal with whatever the results are. Right? So, appreciate this is how Jesus ends this. Do not be afraid, little flock. I appreciate that, like, Jesus is like, talking about like worry and stuff, and he's like, don't be afraid, little sheep. I know you're like a baby sheep and you get afraid by everything. Don't be afraid. For your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think this gets at the idea that when we worry, whether it's about secondary things or it's about important things, when we worry about things, we're often not putting first things first. And we're also often worrying about things that maybe don't matter that much. And if they do matter a lot, well, we don't control them a lot of times. Like, do you think you worry more about, just like, do you worry more about things that you can control or can't control?
Yeah.
You say can or can't?
Can't.
Can't, right? Because if I could control it, I would do something about it, right? So I'm worrying about things, I have anxiety about things, more often about things that I can't control, okay? So I love this idea. It's like, where your treasure is, then your heart will be also. If we put the focus more on what God wants us to put our focus on in life, then we will have less to worry about. And you know what? If you apply to the college that you've been planning since you were like 6 years old, because you really, really like, I don't know, the Timberwolves or some like New Mexico school. You're like, man, I just want to go there so bad. What?
Seems oddly targeted to one specific.
Yes. No one. You were like, man, I just want to go to Alabama, right? I just want to go to Alabama. Roll Tide. And then you put in your application to Alabama, and you don't get in. You know what? Your life is going to be fine. And you know what? as a guy I've been reading recently named Richard Foster would say when he talks about fasting, if you don't eat for a day, you'll be fine. You know what? And if you don't have the latest style and all of your friends don't think that you're super fashionable, you'll be fine. And if we focus more on the things that really matter, we'll be able to store up treasure in heaven, right? We'll be able to focus on the things of God, right? And you know what? No one can stop you from, and what you will always have at least a large amount of control over, is you putting time and effort into growing closer to God. You putting time and effort into spreading the gospel. You putting time and effort into things that will last, because people can't take those things away from you. Okay? So, we are going to talk more about how to deal with worry, how to deal with prayer during our retreat that we're going to be doing on April 14th through 16th. We're talking more about how to pray, how to deal with worry, how to have real conversations with God, how to listen to God. But for now, what I just want to leave you guys with is, when you are in a spot of worry, ask yourself, can I control this? And if you can, well, do something about it. And if you cannot, think to yourself, well, God's got it in his hands, and he's a caring father, and I can trust him, and worrying never got me anything anyways. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hand out some of these as we close up, but I'm going to close in prayer, and then we're going to go to small groups, okay? Everyone bow your eyes and close your heads. Lord, help us to remember that anxiety is something that we can all experience, that we all experience when we feel unease or lack of control. Lord, help us to remember that you're a God who's a solid rock, who's a foundation for us to rely upon and to believe in and to commune with, to have a relationship with. Help us to remember that often the things we are worrying about, worrying about them is not going to change anything, and we can't actually affect the outcome as much as we wish we could. But Lord, help us to care about the things around us, but not to flail around or freeze as we deal with our unease and disquiet. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
We have no time.
We have no time?
It is 7:30.
Oh, perfect. Okay, guys, we are not doing small groups tonight. I apologize. We might have played 4 on a couch too long. So feel free to invite anyone to this.
Pick up your trash.
Yes.
Trash.
In the original game, you can it's impossible. Yes.
He said if we don't eat for a day, we'll be fine. I won't be fine.
What?
I won't be fine. It's fine.
You will.
I'm a strong eater. Honor. Riley has it. Some person. Chase. Some person.
I agree. It's possible. What if you're not going? You don't have to. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, that works. We'll do that. I'll meet you there. Yeah, just text me if it's Wow, let's roll. Yeah, let's head out of here. I gotta keep
It's Friday at 5. He's the one that me on. I'm not trying to get like my sister. I'm the next person, like, if I hang out with too many people, then I don't really You got Friday. I don't actually know if you're yeah, you're enjoying whatever. Okay, think about like 10 minutes. Right. Yeah, let's like have your mom.
See? I'm tired.
Yeah, what time is your practice?
I got it last week.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about that. That's we have had people leave for
Stop here. There we go.
That's.
I'm going to 3 of them.
Yes, I would also.
Jake, I need more.
You want more? Here's a third.
That's okay.
Well, it's so long since we didn't have it.
I know. I was sitting there. I was like, wow, this is a really long
Don't hit the camera.
Okay, go.
I'm turning off the stream.